So we're now recording. Okay, so let me introduce Katherine Gomez, or Kat, as she is also called. I'm really delighted that Kat is able to join us and give us this seminar. This is kind of one of the unexpected, a kind of small unexpected benefit of the situation we're in now, is that we can have these kind of seminars. And Kat is in Melbourne. She's presenting to us from Melbourne. So Kat's from RMIT University in Melbourne. She works in media and communication. She's not a linguist. She knows a lot about language and languages, but she's not a professional linguistics person. She's in media and communication. But she has a host of publications around the area of transient migration and digital communication, and a special interest in international students, which I think is relevant to many of us. Now, today we asked her to talk about her book, which is called Siloed Diversity. I'm sure you're going to explain what you mean by that. Transnational Migration, Digital Media and Social Networks. It's quite a short book. It's in the Palgrave Pivot series, so it's shorter than a normal book. And I think it's really an excellent synthesis of a lot of ideas that have emerged from projects that Kat has carried out over the past few years, particularly projects that were supported by the Universities Australia and an ARC DECRA grant. Yeah, so I'm going to hand over to her in a second, but just a very brief comment on the format. So first, Kat is going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes. Then she's asked me to interrupt her. And then I'm going to ask her some questions for about 15 minutes to try to explore how her work connects with issues of language, to help scaffold that a little bit. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question occurring to you during the presentation, please type it into the chat. And what we'll do is, when it comes to the Q&A time, we'll pick out some questions from the chat, depending how many there are, maybe all of them, maybe some of them, but we'll pick out some questions from the chat and ask you to ask the question using your video at that time. But please put questions into the chat, or just indicate that you want to ask a question during the chat. So now I'll hand over to Kat.
Oh, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Phil. And thank you for having me on this. Well, in Melbourne, it's a gloomy afternoon, but at least we've been having rain, which is nice. And thank you for allowing me to talk about my work. Being an academic, talking about our work is like, the thing that we love to do the most, right? I'm in the School of Media and Comm, and I like to think that, I'm very cross-disciplinary. I was interviewed a few months ago by Elspeth Jones, and so she was like, Kat, you have nothing to do with education, but you write a lot in the area. So I was telling her that, part of that is also because if you come from a different perspective, you see things differently. Like my PhD, believe it or not, was in history, where I specialized in Chinese language cinema. So, far cry from a lot of the work that I do now. But again, it just gives that kind of grounding. And here's my cat making his appearance. This is Humbug. Hi, sweetheart. he likes to interject. Let's put it that way. Anyway, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my book, and again, feel free to interject, and this is going to be really, really interactive. Now, part of the reason why I look at transience, because I think transience is a much more useful term when we talk about migration and mobility. As we know, like migration and mobility are actually two quite separate terms, but then the whole idea of transience is really about flows, right? I don't really like to use the term like temporary migrant when I talk about international students, in part because, there is a transience there when we think about international students. And I was an international student a long time ago. I was an international student when I did my undergraduate at UWA in Perth, and then I went back to Singapore, where I'm from, and then I came back to do my my postgraduate at Melbourne Uni, and my whole plan was to go back to Singapore to take up a job in Singapore. But then everything changed because, as an international student, your life course changes. When you're traveling or when you're transiting, life course changes because what happened? I fell in love. So that changed the way that I viewed myself as a mobile subject as well, where then I became a permanent resident. So, but at the same time, I'm still open to the fact that I may not stay in Australia for the rest of my life if another job comes by, in another country, or if I may go back to Singapore, who knows? So again, that whole notion of transience, where even though for me and for maybe for others, we have this idea that where we are, is quite fluid because we go where the jobs are, we go where we feel we're needed, we go where we think that we will do our best, right? So again, this whole notion of transience, this constant change where we are responding to external forces and to personal forces as well, personal decisions. And one of the things that I do is I look at the digital a lot, and in part because the digital is very much part of everyday life, and as we now know today, is the necessary part of everyday life. And even the digital is changing so much. I mean, think about all of us here. Before we started, I made this comment that we look like the Brady Bunch, right? But at the same time, the way that we even respond to each other, the way that we even present changes. For years we're always told as as educators that when you give a lecture, you must always have a PowerPoint slide so that people can know where what your thought processes are. They can concentrate. But now, if you use a PowerPoint slide, that's an excuse for all of us to go and make a cup of coffee. So what happens is that we start to rethink our own engagements. And even like I wrote this book 2 years ago, or it was published 2 years ago, and even now thinking about it, things have drastically changed. Where not long ago, 8 months ago, mobility was very much part and parcel of everyday life. Now, immobility is part of that mobility concept. Does that make sense? Right? So constant changes. All right. So what is my book about? It's called Siloed Diversity, and it took me like 1.5 years to come up with this term. And it's like Phil was saying, it's based on a whole bunch of projects I've been doing. And and when you do projects, you actually then think through. Whenever you finish one project, you write the X amount of journal papers and that gold standard book. It doesn't stop there because you're still thinking in different ways. And very, very simply, what the book is about is it's about how identity is an important aspect of living everyday life in transience. So, and by identity, we're not talking about identity politics. We're talking about a whole bunch of identities which really matter at different periods of time. So it's things like when I interview international students, many of them basically felt that their nationality was not as important in transience as being an international student. But at the same time, while they have pride in being international students, they don't like to be pigeonholed as international students. So what they felt was that, when people start pigeonholing them as international students, then, and by people I mean sort of like non-international students, then what happens is that they feel that there are a lot of tropes of stereotypical tropes attached to that. And it's not just in Australia, but also with international students I interviewed in Singapore. But at the same time, why I say nationality doesn't matter? Nationality also does matter in terms of providing a safe space. And what was interesting was that, like, when I conducted my study in Singapore and Australia, I found that the international students in Australia were much more open to having social networks that went beyond nationality. So it went beyond co-national. So that means, Malaysian students will have friends from Singapore, friends from Vietnam, friends from, from China. But then with the international students in Singapore, who, mind you, had been there for many more years than international students here, to them, nationality was a little bit more important because they had been in Singapore since they were in secondary school and high school. So, on average, they were in Singapore for about 8 years before I interviewed them, as compared to the international students here who are only here for about 2 years, on average. And what for the students I interviewed in Singapore, nationality was important because it gave them an anchor. And because they had been away from home, from their home countries for so long. But for the international students here, nationality didn't quite matter as much as being someone who's transient, and in particular an international student. So they identified more as international students than they did, with their nationality. And what was interesting about the whole study, or all the different studies, was that, even though those notions of identities mattered so much. So what happened was that people then became locked into like certain silos, right? So you may be an international student, but then you're siloed in in this case, say nationality or language groups. At the same time, you're trying to actually grapple with your different kinds of identities. So I always tell my students as well that we all have many different identities. It's just that when something is more important than another. So, like for instance, like when I was an international student, I took pride at being a PhD student, right? Not so much an international student, but being a PhD student. And so, but that's sort of like, that was sort of like important amongst my peer groups, at Melbourne Uni. But then when I went back to Singapore for holiday, my identities also changed. So did my language. One of the things that I always find fascinating, and I do unconsciously, is that whenever I reach Changi Airport, the way that I speak English changes. I become very Singlish and over the top as well, to the point where it becomes ridiculous. And part of that is because, part of me thinks that if I actually adjust the way that I speak to people in Singapore, then they'll be able to identify with me and maybe understand what I'm saying, and how much I try, whenever you go into a cab, right? Because, Uncle Taxi Driver is always very good at picking up things. I'm always told, oh, I'm always asked, are you Singaporean? Because, there is this difficulty in people trying to actually figure out who I am. And I find that really quite fascinating. And I find that also fascinating with the people that I interview, because they too, have these sort of like similar experiences. So you're constantly sort of like trying your best to negotiate all these spaces. Now, the thing about sort of like, when I talk about in my book about silos as well, I talk about how international students, let's take Australia, for example, how international students gravitate towards each other. One of the things I found is that with international students, what they do is that, they make friends with other international students. And in part because it's also safety and security, and it's also a sense of belonging, especially if you're a new international student, right? You're new to the place, and the people that you meet the very first time are actually other international students. You meet them at orientation. You meet them sometimes when you're fresh off the airplane. When you reach the airport, when you have like Study New South Wales, I think, has like a welcome desk for international students, and and for new international students, that becomes the sense of, this sense of identifying with people who have been through something. And so, for them, it's a kind of like, identify, not just identifying with people, but rather, there's practicality as well in that. But one international student I interviewed had this wonderful line, and he basically said, only international students know how to open bank accounts. So, that the ability to identify with someone in the same, similar experiences becomes actually very helpful. And so what they basically say also is that because they were helped along the way by their seniors who are international students, then they also continue with that. So that cycle kind of, it flows. And so that silo becomes actually really important because it's about support. And if, we fast forward to today, many international students are actually finding a lot of support from each other. I did a small study with colleagues where we were looking at HDR students, and some of them were international students. And so when I interviewed them, they basically said things like, other international students have been really supportive because other international students understand the particular things that they are going through. So again, it's that, that sense of support, that sense of belonging. And in the case of COVID at the moment, it's also a sense of creating resilience for each other. But of course, being in a silo has its problems, right? Two of the things I found was that international students found that they while they connected very well with each other, but they also disconnected from Australian society. And by disconnect, it will be things like very simple, two things, very simple things like news, the media. So a lot of my work also involves, media. I am from a school of media and comms, so there's a bit of, those elements there. And interestingly enough, practically everyone I interviewed in Australia did not have a television set, which is actually not uncommon amongst young people now. But what they basically did was, they wouldn't watch anything that's local. And to international students, what they basically did was, when they come to Australia, they do find news websites which are not from their home country, but it tended to be CNN, BBC as foreign. And practically no one actually watched or listened or read news in Australia. No one read The Age, no one watched the ABC. A lot of students, the majority, and I'm talking about 99% here, did not even know SBS existed, so are quite different. And interestingly enough, the only two programs that students actually watched, which they admitted, was The Voice, because of the music, and it was American music, or English language music, which they were used to because that was what they listened to back home. And MasterChef, because they were thinking that, it's about cooking, so that's this neutral ground, and maybe we can recreate those really complex desserts ourselves. So those are the only two things. And the other thing that I found with the disconnect was that even though students found connections with each other, but and they also said what they want, one of their biggest regrets was not having Australian friends. But how that is also really quite complex to unpack, because while they wanted to make a lot of friends with Australians, their version of Australian was very different from what a version of, say, reading Australian is. So for many international students, they felt that Australian was Caucasian. So if I was Australian, I look like this, I'm not quite considered, right? And there was one student I interviewed from India. He basically was saying things like, and he was really quite interesting because he said that he doesn't identify with Indian Australians, and he said that even though the Indian Australians may look like him, he felt that they didn't identify with him, and he didn't identify with them as well. And that sort of like strengthened in a study that I did with Melbourne Uni, where we surveyed 6,699 international students. It was amazing that we actually had that number, but what was interesting was that we actually asked this question about friendship groups, and we wanted to know whether or not international students were making friends with with Australians and with Asian, with people who were of the same ethnic group as them. And 6,699, people, less than 1% said that they had Australian friends who were of the same ethnic group as them. 0.96 only had. So that also tells you something, that ethnicity doesn't actually really matter for international students. It's about, the experience as an international student and the experience as being transient. And the other thing really was, again, those connections to people, right? So being in a silo, then because you are not connecting with people on the outside, right? So you're not connecting outside the international student silo. What happens is that it becomes an echo chamber, and the echo chamber doesn't allow for this permeation of understanding Australian society. So, whenever I ask international students, what do you think about Australian society or Australians? And it's always those conventional ideas that, oh, Australia is fantastic, Australians are fantastic because Australians are very laid back. And while there is a kind of cultural adaptation, like a lot of international students love to go to for have to go to cafes because they feel that, especially Melbourne, that's a very Melbourne thing. But then what happens is that they go to cafes with each other, so it's a kind of adoption of culture, of what they think the culture is, but not integration, if that makes sense. And one of the concepts that I can't develop doing all this work is suggesting that international students actually live in a parallel society. So they do exactly a lot of things which say domestic students do, but parallel. So what happens is that there is no kind of like integration, which is something that as educators we need to actually think about, because at the end of the day, right, some of these students might become might settle, or and I always tell my undergraduates and also my PhD students that university is such a wonderful time because it's a time that you network. The friends you make today are going to be the friends that are going to be part and parcel of your professional life later on. And I guess so, like for me, so like I've got a new book out, one of my new books out this year, and it's to do with the digital experiences of international students. And it's a co-edited and co-written book. And I co-edited with Shenton Chang, who's at Melbourne Uni. Shenton Chang and I have worked a lot together. Shenton and I actually met as undergraduates in Perth on the first day that we were both in Australia. So as international students, and fast forward a few decades later, we're still actually collaborating. So again, those networks are really important. And it's always amazing how those networks actually can become much stronger once there's those kind of integrations. I'm not sure if I've reached my maximum of 20 minutes or 15 minutes. Kind of. I might sort of like stop talking for a little bit because it's more fun to be sort of interactive rather than one person like just talking away. And I hope sort of like what I said also kind of like made sense.
Let me give you a rest for like 1 minute. So,
And my tea.
I said, I think I told you before that I think your work connects with issues of language in 3 different ways. One is through this idea of the multilingual city and what role transient migrants, particularly international students, might play in that. The second was how, and the one I might ask you about now is about how this idea of siloed identities affects students who kind of specifically come here because they want to, or partly because they want to learn English. And the third one, which you might get to, is about maybe the effects on language maintenance of what you've called this, I like this idea of crisscross movements in migration, of going backwards and forwards, and what effect that may have on maintenance of community languages. But I think I'll take the first one, is the idea of English language students and siloed identities, because I think like what you're saying there is very familiar to English language teachers who are teaching international students in Sydney and Melbourne, who they often complain, actually almost complain, about students staying in their co-national bubbles. So my question really is, so there, the idea is they're staying in their co-national bubbles. So on the one hand, they're not really mixing with English language speakers, let's say native English language speakers in Australia, but also they're often staying within their own language group and not mixing with other international students. So it seems to me that you might agree with one part of that, but not the other part. Yeah, that there are these barriers to mixing with the native speakers, but not so much to mixing with other international students. Would that be right?
Well, that's actually really quite interesting, because like, students really do want to mix around. I interviewed a whole bunch of Chinese students, and they were telling me that they were they want to meet non-Chinese students. But the thing is that the way that we make friends is we make friends through other friends. So Phil, if I'm new to Sydney, so Phil's my best friend, and so what Phil does is you introduce me to your friends, who then introduced me to their friends. And so for the Chinese students, they were telling me, oh, we really want to break the cycle, but we can't, because all our friends are Chinese and all their friends are Chinese. So I think so, like sometimes the bubble becomes accidental. You have the intention there, but then for international students, especially if you're new, right? It takes a lot to just put yourself out there. And for new international students, where Australia sometimes is completely, literally foreign, culturally foreign, linguistically foreign, ethnographically foreign as well. It takes a lot to make that first move. And if that person encounters something that's negative or perceived to be negative, then that sort of like makes that person then go back into a shell, and it takes again a lot to actually make the next move. So I think for the majority of international students, they don't come to Australia in order to keep with their co-nationals. They actually have they have this wide-eyed and wonderful need and desire to actually break out of all that. It's just that sometimes they can't for whatever reasons, and it becomes really quite difficult. And I'll give you sort of like a kind of COVID example here. I interviewed a HDR student who is in Latin America. So she started her PhD with us, or in Australia, sorry, in the beginning of the year, which was unfortunately the worst time to start any kind of education, because it's when you're overseas. And so she is now she's enrolled, but she's in her home country. And so I think universities have got very proactive graduate schools who have been putting out all these wonderful programs for people. And then, but she was telling me that, because she has no network in Australia, because she knows no one in the institution, even though it's as easy as going online, she has this barrier where she feels that it's just too much for her to do that. So for an international student who is coming from a completely different country, it's so hard for them. And so what happens is that if you see a friendly face of someone who looks like you at the airport, who is handing out flyers telling you welcome, you immediately gravitate to that. And sometimes also like with orientations as well, like one of the things that I found in my work is that the people that you meet in your first week in Australia are your friends, and your really good friends, literally for the next 3 years of your life. Because that first week becomes so important, where friendships are formed, and very very sincere, hard and fast friendships are formed. And so once that happens, and as it happens during orientation, so international students have an orientation period of about 4 or 5 days where they get to know each other, they get to know the city they're in, and those friendships become very, very firm and fast. And then institutions then have the half-day orientation where the domestic students come in. And so by that time, your international students have formed their own hardcore friendships, and half a day is not enough for domestic students and international students to mix. At the same time, domestic students are also quite different, where 20 years ago domestic students would be living in shared houses. Fast forward to today, or even 30 years ago, fast forward to today, domestic students are still living with their parents. They are commuting to university with the friends that they've made over the years from high school, and they're doing the same thing going back home. And now that we are in the middle of COVID, what happens is that we are also now not even networking with other people. So that becomes quite difficult. So to kind of like in a very long-winded way of also like trying to answer your question, I think for students, they do, for international students, they do want to break out those bubbles, and they do want to improve their English language skills. So I did. It was interesting because I interviewed these two students together. They were actually friends. One, the guy was from China, and his friend was a girl, was from South Korea, and they had met during Elacos classes, and they were now in two different institutions doing completely different courses, and they were still really good friends. And so they were telling me that they are friends with each other because both don't understand each other's native language, so they're forced to speak English to each other. And for them, that was the way that they were improving their language skills. And the other way that they admitted they were trying to improve their language skills was they watched a lot of American TV. They watched a lot of, and so they were using each other and the media as a kind of dual strategy in order to understand language, right? To improve their English language. But they omitted their integration with domestic students, because like one of them, the guy was telling me that he feels that his language skills are not very good. So what he also was doing at the same time was he was about to enroll himself in another advanced English course, because he felt that until he does that, then will he have the confidence to talk to domestic students. He felt that he basically felt that he was very shy. He was very embarrassed to speak to domestic students because he felt that his language skills were not good enough. But speaking to his friend from South Korea in English was good for him, because he felt that she would not judge him. So those are those kind of like issues that happen with international students, and I gave a talk last year at my own institution where someone actually asked, and at the end of the talk, it was about communicating to international students, and so someone basically asked me, should our signs on campus be in different languages? So I said no, because students come to Australia, come to institutions in order to also improve their language skills. Having signs in different languages actually defeats that purpose. Having signs outside the institution is a different story altogether. But within the institution, it's really quite different. And for students, sometimes how hard it is as well, wanting to improve their language skills is actually one of the primary goals for them to come into Australia.
Yeah, I guess my my thought was really, because you talk about this hierarchy of identities, so the transient identity or the international student identity becomes particularly important. But my thought was that they can have that identity because they have English. They can use English to enact that transient identity. Whereas using English with, say, an Australian domestic students is a very different thing. It's not a matter of developing an identity, a shared identity with the domestic students. So it's a very different kind of use
Mm.
use of the same language in a way. That was my idea. But if you don't mind, I wanted to, there's a couple of points, interesting points made in the chat. So I wanted to unmute a couple of people and see if they make a comment. Sheshton, would you like to make a comment if you're there? Sheshton?
Oh, wait.
I've unmuted you. If you'd like to.
I am here.
Yeah, hi.
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 I'll ask you to come in a moment, yeah?
Yeah. So what was the question?
You put a question, you put a comment or question in the chat. Sheshton is a PhD student and also an English lecturer in Christchurch in New Zealand, and she's doing her thesis on international students in New Zealand.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you want to make a comment, Sheshton?
Yeah. What I said here is that, for example, I must see if I can find what I said. Yeah, in the beginning, you know, when international students try to connect with others, I think, first of all, domestic students, they have already built up their networks.
Yes.
So they are not really
Absolutely.
interested in making new friends unless you are very good at communicating and very outgoing and that kind of person. But also from my own experience, when I came to New Zealand in the beginning, which was about 20 years ago, I remember how people, when I tried to say something, it took much longer, of course, and then they just gave this blank face. And it was like, it was no communication, but I wanted to. So yeah, there are barriers, as Phil says. Yeah.
No, yes, you're right. And for an international student, international students have got more to lose, but more to gain as well. And so, again, those, because of those difficulties, or even a negative experience, or a perceived negative experience, trying to get up on the horse again and trying to make those connections becomes even harder.
Yeah.
And it's about trying to I would say infiltrate, but just trying to make connections. And so like for yourself, right? If one person looks at you and just goes, "I'm not sure what you're talking about," then for you to go to the next person is even harder, right? Because you have to like psychologically tell yourself, no, don't worry. And then if the second person does that, and you just go like, oh, maybe it really isn't them, but it's me.
Yeah.
And so you start to close up, and then we forget.
And also the other international students, they have another way of listening, and they understand a lot more. We have lots in common, even if we are from many different countries in the world.
That's right, because being away from home in a country so different from your own creates these kinds of connections to each other. Because my experience of loneliness and my embarrassments are similar to what you have also experienced. So then there's that immediate connectivity, because purely on the experiences that we're having in this period of time. So it really becomes kind of like this moment in time as well. And it's really interesting you were talking about how domestic students have their own networks. I interviewed this young lady from Italy, and she gave, it was really interesting because she was telling me that domestic students don't want to be friends with her. And I was like, oh, why? This is so sad. And so she actually explained it as exactly what you did. And that she felt that it is because investing in a friendship with her would not be worthwhile, because she will return to Italy, after about 6 months, a year. And that to me, sorry?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I felt sad for her because it was like you're trying to justify. It was about for herself justifying why she wasn't making local friends, and I actually felt sad about that. She explained it beautifully, and she's not wrong either. But at the same time, if you go about everyday life for 3 years thinking no one wants to be friends with me because it's not worth investing the time, that's we need to change that mindset as well. But I don't know how to, because like you're saying, you experience the same thing. I experienced the same thing. The young lady I interviewed experienced the same thing as well, at different points of time.
And especially in the beginning, when the language is not really set or you hesitate, and that they for example, I also commented in the chat there that teachers in my study, they tried to do group work with the students when they mixed up with international students and domestic students. But when I observed classes, I could see that the international students, they were more silent. They didn't get sort of a chance to process the language enough to contribute to the group work. And then all of the groups in that session, the domestic students were reported back to the class.
Could I
think,
before you answer, could I ask Alex Alex, I think, has been waiting to come in with a question for a while, so maybe you could.
I will mute myself now.
That's okay. That's okay. Thanks for your questions, Kirsten.
Hi there, Kat, and hi, everyone.
Hi.
What you're saying and what Kirsten was just saying really resonates with me. I've been the transient person as an international student, and I've been the domestic student. But you already answered sort of one of my questions. I'd put a question in the chat about how the social networks in Australia differ from elsewhere, with people staying at home for university. And you've actually spoken about that. So I'll just go to the other question I raised, which was, I wonder if from your data you can speak a bit about different notions of what it means to be a friend, and maybe how that comes into play, because it's possible, drawing on my own experience, but also watching this play out with other people, that, as the kind of the idealized target first language speaker of English, you can feel that people only want to be friends with you to practice their English, and that can feel quite usurious rather than genuine.
That's actually a really good question, and I think that for international students, I think for them also, the idea of friends only hits them when they actually arrive here, because then the idea of the needs that they have then becomes the challenge, where your friends fill up that void. And like you were saying just now, like one of the questions I asked was, or one of the responses I had was, we are friends with other international students because only international students know how to open a bank account. Only international students know where the really good Asian groceries are.
So that sort of practical, useful thing that, you might not need to know if you're just in the same city, still living with your parents.
Yes, absolutely. And so it's very practical based. And and in Melbourne in particular, right? Postcode 3000, which is the CBD area. We have a lot of international students who live in this area. And so again, the needs of those international students will be very different from the domestic students who are living in the suburbs. So the information that they need and require is also different from students in the suburbs. And so what you basically have here is the idea of what a friend is. You're absolutely right. It's very different from what a friend, or perhaps and I'm going to be very absolutist here, what a domestic student might want, because their needs are different. The idea also for international students in relationship to friendships is also that the friend fills a void of the family. So for international students, your good friend is not just a good friend. Your good friend is also your brother, your sister, your mother, your grandmother.
Your go-to person. for everything.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And you're like, one of my first projects about international students, we were actually, talking about, we were asking them about information seeking. And so we had sort of like a bit of a contentious question, because we're also working with a community group who wanted to know about pregnancy and whether or not where would international students go to for information about pregnancy. And no one will, of course, say, I'm going to ask my mother if I'm pregnant. What should I do in Australia? But what they do is they ask their other friends. And this is where the silos come into play and becomes quite problematic, where if all your friends are from China, and the only thing that you know about China is information about China when it comes to, say, in this case, pregnancy. And what happens then is that they don't get the information about, okay, what happens when I get pregnant when I'm in Australia? Who do I go to? So you've got those kind of like issues that happen. And one of the things that we found with that giant study that we did is that the friendship groups, the more diverse your friendship group, the better your knowledge of Australia. So if you are just, so I'm Singaporean, so if I'm just friends with all Singaporeans, then what I know of Australia is from a very Singaporean perspective. Right? Now, if I'm friends with Singaporeans and three New Zealanders, then the information that I have, my knowledge of Australia, is then widened through this New Zealand perspective as well. Ideally, what we want is international students to have friends with other international students and with domestic students, because then that also benefits the domestic students as well. And I think this is the thing about all of us who do work about international students. We focus so much on international students, but we forget to focus on the domestic as well, because the domestic also has sometimes much more of an impact on the experience of an international student than international students themselves. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does. It does. Thank you. I see Jill has asked a related comment, but I'll mute myself again now. Thanks, Kat.
Jill, would you like to come in and ask the question?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. I was just
a colleague from linguistics.
It looks like you are enjoying this beautiful spring day behind you.
Oh, well, it gives it a more of a Friday feeling. It looks better than my wall. Okay, so I was interested in whether your participants had any idea about how long it takes to develop a friendship. And one thing that made me think about that is that yesterday I was actually teaching a class in my Languages and Cultures in Contact class. And we used a TED talk by a Dutch woman called Valerie Hoek, who talked about her experiences with China. And she described how she was sitting in a park and a girl came up to her and said she'd like to be her friend. And I thought at the time, I would find that rather off-putting. I think friendship is something that develops gradually. It develops with a lot of exposure. And maybe what we have here is international students not being aware of these conventions so much, going sort of full bore and basically just scaring off domestic students. Did that come up at all in your research?
That's actually really interesting. And it's funny you say that, because like the things that was going through my mind was, one is, I can imagine sort of like people coming out to you, and it's like before COVID, right? One of the things that I was observing in Melbourne city itself was there were, rather than the international students going to non-international students to ask, will you be my friend? I actually saw a lot of the other way around, but it was the it was the Seventh-day Adventists, or the Mormons, who were approaching.
They always want to be your friend, yes.
Yeah, and it's quite sophisticated now, right? Where they learn Mandarin and and that the same thing happened to me when I went to Singapore. you know, where I was approached because I do look as if I do need saving, and it was really quite interesting, and I wanted to play around with that, but then I thought, okay, maybe I'll just that would be just a bit mean on my part, but that's actually a really good question, because I think for international students, because they have a finite period of time, you're trying to squeeze in as much experiences as you can, or what you think you can, and the finite period of time, it differs for everyone else. LCOS students are here for anywhere from a few months to a year. Undergraduate students are here for anywhere from a year to 3 years. Postgraduate students, different kettle of fish altogether. I did not get the sense that students of like thoughts quite critically about the period of time, but I basically had the feeling, or that they thought that once they reached Australia, they will make all these friends. And in part is also because of the way that we market Australia. If you look at all the different kinds of marketing material, the images, right? You always have this group of very happy, young looking, very good looking, by the way, young people, either sort of like by the beach, but in a cafe, and like and thus all these sort of like visual markers where in a group of 5, 4 of them are Caucasian, 1 is Chinese, and so that gives the impression that once you come to Australia, you're going to make all these friends. And then like when I interview people, right, especially those who live in the Melbourne CBD, they'll tell me things like, they think that Australia is very multicultural, but then they think the multiculturalism comes from the fact that all the other people that they see walking along Swanston Street, our main street, are all other international students. So they actually see it from there. But then they also express this kind of displeasure that, that they never. Yeah, I'll give you an example. One person who I interviewed from China basically said this: if she knew Australia was so Asian, she wouldn't have come. So again, I find that really quite interesting. So there are these perceptions, but at the same time, there's also comfort in finding people who are similar to you. And by similar, again, it's not specifically ethnicity, or nationality, but it's really this whole idea of being transient. And so when I interview people, they actually, especially in Australia, part of that sort of like friends with other international students is not specifically co-nationals. It tends to also be more regional, where like someone will tell me things like if I'm Singaporean, then Malaysians will understand me more. It was interesting where like when I interviewed non-Chinese international students, everyone said that they had a friend who was Chinese. But then the Chinese students who felt that they really needed to expand their circles desperately wanted to make friends with anyone else besides Chinese students. And so they were telling me that they ended up making friends with their tutors instead, because that was the closest that they had to the local, So to, again, try to answer your question in a very, very long way, I think my feel is that while none of them basically, I didn't read, they did not verbalize that they expected friendship straight away, but there was a disappointment in that. And if you look at all the exit surveys, right, like those international student barometers, many students, not just in Australia but the UK and Canada, all say the same thing, that they kind of like their their education experience, but their one biggest regret is that they don't have, after 3 years, domestic friends in their social circles.
Okay.
And it's not just an Australian thing.
We're kind of running out of time. If I can, I'd like to squeeze in just a couple of more questions or comments quickly. This question of friend has really created quite a lively chat. And I just wanted to ask Crystal, who's a PhD student in linguistics, Yongju Lee, if she'd like to comment what you've commented in the chat.
Well, I initially made a comment that perhaps making friends takes time. in
Yes.
any countries with any languages.
Mm.
So living in Australia, perhaps about 6 months, not gonna guarantee to make friends. That's what I initially commented, but by kind of like listening your comments and explanation and like kind of thinking about my previous experience of study abroad, perhaps for international students, they might be aware of what making friends is, and perhaps what making friends for them might mean just to have at least one person to have a chat daily, whether it's for purpose of making improving English skills, or whether it's for kind of relieving their loneliness and depression away from home.
Yeah.
So, but then of course it's hard to like make friends or to have a chance to have a chat with Australians, because I'm sure that Australians are also aware of those international students to kind of, like approach to them to practice English and to, have a chat. And when I live, yeah, so it's kind of like different aspects of from different parties, I think.
That's actually a brilliant comment, and I think so. Like, my feel is that I don't think domestic students think that they're going to be used as a practice board, right? But you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry, my dog is barking. He's very furious at people walking outside the door. But you're absolutely right. It's about the different expectations as well. And also it also depends on who you're speaking to, right? So like and making a good friend is a hit and a miss, right? You can be in a whole class. Like, I teach Asian studies, and when I teach that year, it breaks my heart sometimes to see my domestic students sit on one side and my international students sit on another side. And these kids have been they know each other for 3 years, and that really does break my heart. So what I do in my assignments is I don't force students to mix around. I build it in my assignments where they organically actually want to be with each other, because they it's about learning from each other's experiences. So even though my domestic students who do Asian studies out of, because it's an elective, interesting enough, they don't make friends also with the students in the class who are also from Asia. Which again is very interesting for me. So whenever I ask my domestic students, why are you doing Asian studies? So they'll say things like, oh, I did exchange in Asia. I love Asia. I love Chinese food. My girlfriend is from Japan. I actually had that once as well. But interesting enough, for 3 years in the same class, they still did not make friends with each other. And it could be personality, different personalities, or spending 3 hours a week is really not enough. It's really, after class, I always tell my students, after class, go and have coffee with each other, because knowing each other is going to be a really good thing, because in 30 years time, you're actually going to be depending on each other, in terms of professional networks and all that. But again, for young students, it's also that time in their life, what they are planning to do. And students today are also quite different. Where, like 20 years ago when I did my undergraduate, we went out for coffee, in part because most people didn't work. Domestic students today, so many work, so after class, you're rushing off to somewhere else. And now that we are in COVID and doing this, it's also so hard to do this kind of relationship building, because when 4 o'clock comes, we'll all say goodbye to each other and then do our own thing, right? We're not going to actually stay or come, let's open another chat and have coffee with each other, because we don't know how to do it. Not that we don't want to, we just don't know how to do it, and this does not facilitate either. So you've got all those sort of like different kind of factors happening, which you're completely correct, and it's about how those factors also play in terms of how we negotiate that facilitation of friendships. Does that make sense?
Could I ask one more of our PhD students, Yijun, just to make a quick comment on that? And then if Suzanne, if you are still there, I'd like to take your question about health literacy. But Yijun, would you just like to make a quick comment?
Yes. Hi, Kat. Thanks for your wonderful speech. And I'm also quite interesting about your work because I've also done my research with international students, but they're more like Chinese international students here in Sydney and also in New Zealand, Auckland as well. And I found one thing which is quite interesting about Chinese students is that they kind of have very close tie with the social network nowadays. So everything they do is very closely connected to the online social media and online social networks. And it's also quite interesting that the social networks they used for their daily interaction, it's very different from the, like, it's not Facebook, it's not Twitter.
No.
It's like Chinese equivalent of everything. So, which is kind of gives them a barrier that leaves them far away from the major Australian or New Zealand community. And also, speaking about the friendship, I think you mentioned earlier about the students meet their friends in the orientation day or like the first day in a class. But many of my participants said they met before online, even before they came to Australia or came to New Zealand. So like for Chinese students, they have like closed WeChat groups.
Yes.
So they talk about how to prepare your luggage, what should you bring to Australia, everything before they even come to Australia. And they sort of have their own like roommate already, even when they're back in China. So that's what I want to share. Yeah.
Okay. Can I just say that as a comment? Can we just say that as a comment? Because Suzanne, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Suzanne has a question on a different topic. I'd like to take it if we can, about health literacy.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I could speak to the other topic, but I won't. So my question is about a comment that you made, and just following on from the last commenter as well, and that is about this tendency to read the news that is not Australian news. And I think at the moment, specific to the COVID situation, it's really important to get Australian sources to know exactly what's happening. And I've seen international students who don't and are very disconnected to what's happening, and it's quite dangerous to be quite disconnected to what's happening here. And also in my own research, I'm looking at the way that international families are getting advice about how to raise their children multilingually, and I'm seeing that a lot of this advice is coming from their own social circles and not any local advice. And this, I guess, disconnection between local services, local news sources, and this reliance on their own networks and social media. While your own social networks and social media can be quite comforting and quite familiar, it can be quite, I want to say, dangerous, but also quite detrimental, because you're cutting yourself off from a lot of local sources that could be really useful. So what do you see as a way to address this? Like, how can we get international students to follow things that are more local? And I mean, SBS is amazing, and the ABC, like these are really great sources of news and advice and information. How can we get international students hooked up with this? That's my question. Thank you.
Where are you doing your research, Suzanne? Where?
Right here in Monash.
Oh, you're in Monash?
Sorry, I forget that I'm not here in Monash. I'm sorry, I've been on Zoom all day in Monash. I'm doing hi everyone. I'm from Melbourne. I'm doing my research here at Monash University in Melbourne. And my topic is, my topic that I hope to be able to bring to fruition, because everything is shut down here in Victoria, is on multilingualism and multilingual advocacy in health services, and how health professionals can work with CALD families to raise their children in their heritage languages. And so the problem is that But the problem is that families aren't being proactive in asking questions of health professionals because they don't know that they can, because in their home countries they don't do that, and then maybe they're not very proactive in asking questions, and they prefer to go to their friends and their social networks and their families, and they don't want to kind of outsource this information because maybe they think of it as being private, or maybe they just don't do this in their own home countries. And then the gap is that professionals here and people here are thinking, well, you have to come to me, you have to ask me for questions, you have to, invite me out. So there's this disconnect, and I'm trying to see how we can bridge this gap. Thank you.
All right, I think I also like I'll answer both in a way. Like you check out my work on digital journeys. I actually talk about exactly what you were talking about. It's an entire paper, and what I do, and this sort of like links to what Suzanne was saying. What we do is we actually talk about how international students take a digital journey, and we've always wondered about what is the trigger to make international students then adopt the kinds of digital technologies that are used in Australia. Because you're actually, the two of you are absolutely right. It is an issue. It is a problem, especially with Chinese students. Are absolutely correct. Where it's quite interesting. Where with China, like a colleague of mine, Fazal Rizvi, he talks about how how Chinese students, they can be in the middle of Melbourne, right? But they are mentally, psychologically still part of China because of this, and what I'm interested in is how and when, what is the trigger to make students then not convert, but rather take on the multiple digital technologies. What basically I found in my research is that Daniel Miller talks about polymedia and how migrants in particular have different kinds of social media platforms and for different purposes. But I talk about polylingual media because for international students in particular, what happens is that you are balancing not just a few platforms, you're also balancing platforms in different languages. So with international students, international students are fantastic people because international students are balancing so many things at the same time. At the same time, you're also thinking, international students are also thinking in different languages, and trying to actually sort of like make sense of everything is actually really difficult. One of my PhD, one of my research assistants interviewed a Chinese student, and for one whole year, she had dinner with her parents who were back in China. So how she did it was this, like what we're doing now. So rather than having dinner with her friends here in Melbourne, she was for one entire year having dinner with her parents like this, right? So again, this digital media becomes both a blessing and a curse. It creates connectivity to what you are familiar with. By the same time, it disconnects in the here and now. It disconnects in terms of that spatial environment. And it's really quite fascinating because and this is where like Suzanne, you asked such a brilliant question. When when is that change made? And to be honest, this is something that I've been grappling with as well. It's a question that I constantly ask as well. But I think that what's also interesting is that different cohorts have a different way of doing things too. And you were commenting about SBS and ABC. And what's interesting really is that for many international students, like SB, they don't need SBS. They have it's not YouTube, because now YouTube is considered like for anyone above the age of like 45. But they have things like TikTok. They have things like things like Twitch, and So for young people, and what's interesting is that young people are constantly changing the platforms that they use. I gave a talk last year in December, mind you, to high school teachers, and so we mentioned TikTok, and they looked at us and went, "What the hell is TikTok? Is it like has to do with a clock?" And then fast forward a few months later, TikTok is something that we talk about literally on the daily basis. This time next year, it might be another new kind of social media platform that takes the world by storm. So again, the digital world is fascinating because it is constantly changing. It is so flexible. It's so, in a way, unstable as well, right? But unstable in a different kind of way. And so what happens is that, for especially with international students, they are so much more in touch than we are. And so trying to keep track becomes quite interesting. But at the same time, the way that they engage with all these different social media platforms, there is a thread that goes through. It's about familiarity, right? It's about connectivity. But at the same time, with connectivity, there's also the disconnect. But it's also about whether or not the disconnect is worth the connect. Does that make sense? So you're disconnecting with the world around you in Australia, but you're still connecting with friends and family back home. So would friends and family be actually much more important, especially if you're first year? And you're absolutely right, kids, in China or even elsewhere, are connecting with people who are coming to Australia, because it's about creating this instant domestic environment. It's also about supporting each other. And that always takes place during all those like pre-departure pre-departure talks. I remember like when I was an international student, when I was an undergraduate, I went for a pre-departure talk, and people are trying to network there, because once you start to get to know each other there, then you have a friend on the plane, you have a friend already coming there. So it's very practical, and it also makes sense. We don't want to break that per se, but what we want to do is expand that beyond those small little networks.
Okay, people are apologizing for leaving early, but actually we're running late, so no need to apologize. This room's open till 4:30, but I think we are kind of running late, so I think it'd be a good idea to wind up now. And I think Suzanne's question made a nice transition, firstly to the fact that we're talking about international students as if there are thousands and thousands of international students still coming every day. And of course they're not. So there's a whole issue about what's going to happen to transient migration in a year or two ahead, which is a much bigger question. But also Kat's is running a conference actually tomorrow. And
no, it's in February, but
oh, it's in February. What do you want to say something about that conference?
I'll put it in the chat. It's run on fresh air and sunshine volunteerism. It's called Coronavirus and its Impact on International Students. I'm going to put the link in the chat now. No, I can't find the chat. Oh, here we go. Here we go. And it work. Register it work. Because I don't know how to chat. Hang on a second. Okay, here we go. Did it work? No?
Not yet. Can I do it? Is it just?
Yes. Yeah, I think can you do it? Can you see it?
I have an email from you, don't I? Yeah,
okay, I can do that too.
It's not coming up in the chat. No, it's not coming in the chat yet. I'll get an email and I'll get the link and put it in.
It's called it's on Coronavirus and its Impact on International Students, and it's a free conference. And registrations are open, and it's basically going to be online because seriously, borders are not going to open by February. And interesting enough, like I conceive this sort of like really in February March, and it just went. It was really interesting because we had such a huge amount of interest in terms of abstracts, to the point where I actually had to say no to a few people, and because people are now doing the research on it, it's we have panels on things like support, on inclusion, exclusion. Oh, thank you. And if you can come, you do come, and we've got multiple panels. And the beauty about being online is that you can, and because it's free as well, you can attend the ones that you want to attend. And we've got the Melbourne Immigration Museum as well, talking about their new installation about international students, which you guys might be interested in. So you do take a look. And what I wanted to say also is that, again, this was run on fresh air and sunshine and volunteerism, and the volunteers were all international students, because I actually initially made the website, which was really ugly, and they came in and helped and made it beautiful. And again, so like and I really like the fact that international students themselves are actually getting involved in an academic conference, in different ways, shape, and forms, and because they felt that this affects them. So if you're free, you register and do come by. And we made it a 1 day, completely packed. We didn't think that it would take off this well, but yeah, do come if there's things that interest you. So check out the website, again, done by international student volunteers, because I can't save myself to do that. Oh, so cute. You're giving me yeah, I tried the 3 dots, didn't work for me. But thank you.
Phil, you're on mute.
Oh, who, me?
Phil.
Oh, Phil.
I think
Phil.
he's speaking.
Oh, Phil, we can't hear you.
Phil, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't know who muted me. Must have been me. Okay, I want to say thank you first to everybody who came, but especially to Kat. And I just want to say that she's been talking about a book. So go grab the book from wherever you can. If you're at Macquarie University, I ordered it for the library, and amazingly, the ebook arrived yesterday. So it's there if you want to check it out. Everybody can check it out at the same time, I think, or maybe they can't, but it's a really, really good book. And I think actually we've not got stuck, but we zeroed in on international students, but there's a lot more in the book, particularly about this concept of transient migration, that I think is really important to us as linguists, but also as anybody who's interested in education in this country. So let me say thank you again to Kat, and
Oh, pleasure. Thank you.
anybody have anything else they'd like to say before we leave, before we close?
It's Friday evening.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Oh, thank you for having me, everyone. Stay safe and sane as well.
Thanks,
you.
Kat.
Right.
Thank
Okay.
you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
And thank you, Phil.
Okay,
Thanks,
Barry.
Phil.
When is St Kilda playing? Tonight? Or
Tonight.
Tonight. Okay, I'll keep my eye
I'm so nervous.
I'll keep my eye open. Hope they
See ya.
see ya.
Bye.